Today, we take a look at the most dumb ways Karens died as tourists. From a Karen who could not resist grabbing a desert cactus despite every posted sign telling her not to a Karen who walked past a posted warning onto frozen lake ice she had no business being on. A sheet of certainty that only looks solid from a distance. It was July 14th, 2016, in a desert nature park outside Tucson, Arizona. The preserved stretch of Sonoran Desert was lined with marked walking trails weaving between towering saguaro cacti, some rising over 40 feet tall. Warning signs posted along the paths instructed visitors not to touch, lean on, or disturb the plants due to their fragile internal structure. Laureen Brower was 52 years old and worked as a bank teller in suburban Ohio. She traveled alone once a year and treated each trip as a personal showcase, documenting her visits heavily online and comparing her photos to other tourist posts. During past vacations, she had developed a habit of pushing past minor restrictions at viewpoints and challenging access limits when they interfered with the image she wanted. She had little interest in the desert itself and chose the park mainly because she believed she could recreate and improve photos she had seen online, aiming to position herself closer to the towering saguaros than most visitors were allowed. She arrived mid-morning, already irritated by the heat and long walking distances. Instead of stopping at the ranger station, she moved straight toward the trailhead, glancing briefly at the posted guidelines before turning away and continuing with her camera ready. Within 10 minutes, she stepped off the marked trail toward a dense cluster of saguaros. A couple walking behind her pointed toward a warning sign as she crossed into the restricted area. Laureen turned back, gestured sharply toward the trail in her camera, and lingered in a tense exchange before waving them off and continuing deeper into the open desert. The ground grew uneven beneath her feet, scattered with loose gravel and shallow roots pushing through dry soil as the trail disappeared behind her. She stopped at one of the larger cacti and set her camera on a nearby rock for a timed shot. The saguaro's trunk measured roughly 2 feet across, with a mid-height arm extending outward several feet above her head. Its surface appeared firm and intact, giving no visible sign of the internal damage hidden beneath. Another visitor called out from the trail and motioned toward the posted barriers. Laureen glanced back, made a brief dismissive motion, and repositioned herself closer to the cactus to adjust her angle. Saguaro arms often begin forming along the trunk more than 10 feet above the ground and can weigh well over 100 pounds due to water-dense tissue stored inside. Over time, bacterial necrosis can hollow the interior, weakening the structure while leaving the outer skin mostly unchanged. As Laureen reached up and pulled on the arm for balance, shifting her weight into it, the compromised joint failed. The arm broke free without warning and dropped heavily onto her upper back and neck, driving her forward into the gravel. She did not move after the impact. The couple on the trail witnessed the arm detach from about 15 feet away and rushed toward the trail entrance to alert park staff, while another visitor approached cautiously. Rangers reached the area roughly 20 minutes later and approached carefully due to the dense spines covering the detached arm before confirming she had suffered fatal cervical spine injuries along with severe blunt force trauma. The detached arm was documented before removal, and investigators determined she had knowingly left the marked trail, ignored multiple warnings from other visitors, and physically handled the cactus despite posted restrictions. The death was ruled accidental, with no negligence attributed to park management. The surrounding section of trail was temporarily closed while staff inspected nearby saguaros for additional structural damage before reopening to the public. Laureen's camera was recovered at the scene, still containing photos she had taken earlier that morning. Laureen's need for a better photo had taken her 30 feet off the trail and under 100 pounds of rotting cactus. But nearly 1,000 miles northeast in Colorado, another woman's refusal to follow a simple safety instruction was about to cost her a great deal more than a good shot. It was March 9th, 2017, at a commercial zipline facility along a narrow canyon outside Durango, Colorado. Guided groups crossed a series of lines between rim platforms, with the longest stretching about 200 feet above the canyon floor. Each participant wore a full-body harness system with hip and leg loops, supported by a secondary chest clip designed to keep the harness plate centered during the ride. Janelle Briscoe was 44 years old and ran a nail salon out of a strip mall in central Georgia. She traveled several times a year and preferred fast-paced, activity-driven stops that fit tightly into her schedule, often growing impatient with long briefings or procedures she felt were unnecessary. On previous trips, she had argued with staff over wait times and equipment requirements, presenting herself as experienced despite having limited training. She was not particularly athletic, but carried herself with confident authority and tended to dismiss instructions she believed slowed the group down. She booked the Zipline tour the night before and arrived without reviewing the facility's preparation guidelines. She arrived with a group of 8 strangers, was visibly impatient during the ground briefing, and interrupted the staff member twice while the harness system was being explained. Before the harness fitting began, she spent several minutes at the staging area, making comments to the people standing near her about how simple the setup looked and how the briefing was probably longer than it needed to be. She picked up a spare carabiner from an equipment table without asking, turned it over in her hands, and set it back down when a staff member gave her a look. She had already decided she knew enough. When her harness was fitted, she complained immediately that the secondary chest clip was pressing uncomfortably against her sternum. The staff member told her it was mandatory and non-negotiable. Janelle waited until the staff member moved on to the next person, unclipped the secondary fastener herself, and tucked it flat against the harness strap. Before moving to the launch platform, she draped her jacket loosely over the front of the harness, which concealed the unclipped fastener from the staff member's final visual check at the platform edge. She was cleared to launch. The canyon was visible from the launch platform in both directions, a narrow cut in the rock roughly 200 feet below the cable. The line extended outward from the platform at a slight downward angle and disappeared toward the far rim. 2 participants from the group were already making their way across. The staging area behind her was quiet. Approximately 80 feet into the run, the primary harness plate began shifting laterally without the chest clip holding it in position. The shoulder loop on her left side loosened progressively as the plate rotated under the load and speed of the ride. Her left arm slipped through the widening gap, and the harness shifted out of position within seconds, allowing her torso to slip free from the system. She separated from the line cleanly, without contacting the cable or the trolley above her, and fell into the open canyon below. 2 participants who had already reached the landing platform on the far rim, and one still waiting at the launch platform, witnessed the fall. None were in a position to intervene. She fell approximately 200 feet and landed on the canyon floor. The tour was halted immediately, and the remaining participants were walked back to the staging area. Janelle was confirmed dead at the scene. A review of her harness confirmed the secondary chest clip had been manually unfastened prior to launch. Staff provided documentation of the pre-launch briefing and the mandatory chest clip policy. Witness accounts from 3 participants corroborated that the staff member had correctly fitted and explained the harness before Janelle tampered with it. The case was closed as an accidental death with no negligence found on the part of the facility. The jacket she used to conceal the unclipped fastener was recovered at the launch platform. Janelle had spent years presenting herself as someone who did not need instructions. A single unclipped fastener proved otherwise. But 2 states away in New Mexico, a woman who mistook prior experience for expertise was about to cross a rope she had no business touching. It was September 3rd, 2015, in a small private show cave built into a limestone cavern system outside Carlsbad, New Mexico. Guided groups moved through the main chambers, while all side passages remained roped off and strictly restricted due to lower ceilings, unstable rock, and wet, uneven flooring. Florine Decker was 57 years old and worked as a floor supervisor at a grocery store in western Texas. She had planned a solo weekend trip with a short list of nearby tourist sites she wanted to visit. She was the kind of person who needed to be the most informed person in any group she joined and had a visible resistance to being told what to do by anyone she considered beneath her. She had taken cave tours before and treated that prior experience as sufficient reason to disregard instructions she felt were redundant. She joined a group of 11 for a standard 90-minute tour, positioned herself near the front, and began talking over the guide during the entrance briefing. The guide addressed her directly after she touched a formation in the first chamber. She touched a second one shortly after, and the guide reminded the entire group again. By the second chamber, Florine had drifted toward a roped side passage about 8 feet from where the others were standing. The guide was answering a question from a tourist at the far end of the chamber when Florine stepped over the rope and moved into the passage alone. The temperature dropped noticeably within the first few feet of the passage. The ceiling came down quickly from the main chamber height to just over her head, and the walls narrowed on both sides until her shoulders were close to brushing the stone. The sound of the tour group faded almost immediately, replaced by the faint drip of mineral water somewhere further in, and the sound of her own footsteps on the wet floor. She kept moving further in. The walls were close enough on both sides that her arms brushed the stone when she did not keep them in front of her. The ceiling continued dropping, and she had to tilt her head forward within a few steps. Her shoulders were no longer clearing the walls cleanly, and she had begun angling her body sideways before she reached the narrowest point. The passage ran roughly 15 feet before tightening to a gap of about 16 inches wide at chest height, with a ceiling dropping to just over 4 feet. The floor was slick with mineral moisture and sloped slightly downward. Florine moved into the narrow section and turned sideways to push through. As she forced her way through, her movement disturbed a partially loosened ceiling slab, approximately 3 feet across, that dropped and landed across the passage directly behind her, sealing the only way back. The passage ahead narrowed further to an impassable point within a few feet. She was enclosed in a section too tight to turn around in, too low to stand upright in, and completely blocked at the only exit. 3 tourists standing near the rope line had watched her enter and heard the slab drop. They called out to the guide immediately. The guide reached the rope line within seconds. Florine was audible but could not move or breathe effectively in the confined space. The passage walls pressed against her chest and restricted her ability to expand her lungs fully. She gradually lost consciousness as the pressure on her chest prevented full breaths before the slab could be cleared and did not recover. The cause of death was determined to be positional asphyxia resulting from chest compression in a confined space. A review confirmed Florine had stepped over the rope barrier voluntarily after being addressed twice by the guide. Witness accounts from 3 tourists corroborated the full sequence of events. The case was closed as an accidental death with no negligence found on the part of the facility. The side passage was permanently sealed following the incident. Florine had walked into that passage convinced the rules were for people who knew less than she did. The cave did not care. But back in Arizona, a recently retired woman with no patience for guidance was about to step onto ground that had been waiting years to give way. Subscribe for a new dose of What Were They Thinking every week, and drop a comment telling us which Karen had the worst survival instincts. It was October 22, 2018, in a petrified forest preserve in northeastern Arizona. The site was a federally protected stretch of desert badlands containing thousands of fossilized logs scattered across an eroded landscape of low ridges and shallow gullies. Marked walking trails ran between the main fossil clusters, and posted signs at the trailhead and along the path warned visitors that removing petrified wood was a federal offense and that leaving the trail was prohibited due to unstable terrain. Estelle Diggins was 63 years old and had recently retired after spending the better part of 3 decades as an office administrator at a mid-sized company in central Oklahoma. She had taken up solo road tripping in her first year of retirement and considered herself a seasoned traveler who no longer needed guidance from anyone. She carried herself with a quiet but persistent condescension toward younger visitors and park staff alike, and had a habit of framing rule-breaking as a sign of experience rather than ignorance. She arrived at the preserve in the early afternoon, declined a trail map at the entrance station, and started down the main path at her own pace. Within the first quarter mile, she stepped off the trail to examine a fossilized log cluster more closely. A ranger on foot patrol spotted her and redirected her back to the path. She returned without argument and waited until the ranger was out of sight before stepping off again at a second cluster further down the trail. She moved between 2 large horizontal fossilized logs lying close together, stepping onto the ground between them to get a better look at the surface detail of the nearer log. The logs were each several feet in diameter and had been lying in the same position for an estimated 200 million years, their original wood tissue replaced entirely by silica over time. The surfaces were rough and multicolored, streaked with deep reds and grays from the mineral content of the surrounding soil. The ground between them was pale and dry, packed hard enough that it did not shift under her first step, with no visible cracks, depressions, or discoloration to suggest anything beneath it was hollow. The area had come off a wet spring, followed by an unusually dry summer, a cycle that accelerates the formation of subsurface erosion cavities beneath the hardened desert crust. The ground between the two logs appeared identical to the surrounding terrain, firm, dry, and stable. It was not. A shallow erosion cavity had formed directly beneath the surface layer, hollowed out by seasonal water movement through the porous sediment below. The crust held for a half second under Estelle's weight before collapsing. She dropped approximately 8 feet into a narrow cavity, roughly 3 feet wide, landing feet first before pitching sideways against the cavity wall. The impact was immediate and severe. She came to rest wedged at an angle with no room to maneuver. A family of 4 on the marked trail had been watching her from about 25 feet away and saw the ground give way beneath her as she dropped into a narrow cavity. The adults called out, but could not reach her without leaving the path themselves. A ranger was flagged down within minutes. Estelle was found wedged in the cavity, minimally responsive and unable to move, with a visible deformity to her left leg, consistent with the drop and impact. She became unresponsive shortly after being located and did not recover. The cause of death was determined to be spinal trauma and internal injuries sustained in the fall. A review confirmed she had left the marked trail twice and had been redirected by a ranger on the first occasion before returning to the restricted terrain voluntarily. The family's account corroborated the full sequence of events. The case was closed as an accidental death with no negligence found on the part of the preserve. The cavity was marked and fenced off before the site closed for the evening. Estelle had outrun one ranger and ignored everything the terrain put in front of her. The ground simply ran out before she did. But nearly 2,000 miles north in Minnesota, a woman who had never stood on frozen lake ice was already certain she understood it better than the people who had posted the warnings. It was February 7th, 2016, in a frozen lake recreational area along the northern shoreline of a state forest in central Minnesota. The area was a popular winter destination for ice fishing and lakeside walks during the colder months. Seasonal boundary ropes marked the sections of ice that had been tested and cleared for public use. Sections outside the ropes had not been assessed and were posted with thin ice warning signs at several points along the shoreline. Cindy Sorrell was 48 years old and worked as a real estate agent at a small independent brokerage in southern Wisconsin. She traveled frequently for leisure and prided herself on being more adaptable and capable than the average tourist in any environment she visited. She had no experience with frozen lake terrain and no particular knowledge of ice conditions, but carried herself as though both were unnecessary. She had stopped at the recreational area on impulse during a solo winter drive through the region, drawn by the sight of the frozen lake from the road, and hoping to walk far enough out onto the ice to take closer photos of the fishermen she could see in the distance. She parked, walked to the shoreline, and read the thin ice warning sign at the boundary rope. She turned to a man standing nearby with a dog and pointed out that ice fishermen were clearly visible roughly 400 feet out on the lake, using their presence as evidence that the ice across the entire surface was safe. The man told her that the fishermen were in a tested and marked zone, and that the shoreline section near the rope was flagged for a reason. Cindy stepped over the rope without responding and walked out onto the ice. The ice surface looked uniform from where she had been standing at the rope, and it looked the same up close. It was pale and opaque, without any visible dark patches or surface pooling that she had been told to watch for on dangerous ice. It held firm under her first several steps and made no sound. Nothing about it felt different from the tested section further out where the fishermen had set up. She had stopped about 20 feet past the rope and was standing still on the surface. From that distance, the boundary rope behind her looked small, and the fishermen further out were clearly visible, moving around their equipment without any sign of difficulty. The ice under her boots was flat and white and gave no indication of what was directly beneath it. The section she entered sat over a shallow basin basin close to the shoreline, where water depth and temperature variation caused the ice to freeze unevenly and unpredictably. She had walked approximately 20 feet past the boundary rope when the ice gave way across a several-foot section around her without warning. She dropped through into water approximately 7 feet deep. The broken ice around the hole shifted inward as she grabbed at the edges, and each attempt to pull herself out broke the surrounding shelf further and widened the opening. The water temperature was well below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The man with the dog and 2 other visitors at the rope line witnessed the fracture and the drop. The man unspooled a retractable leash to its full length and lay flat on the ice to distribute his weight while reaching toward her, but could not get close enough to the hole without the ice giving way beneath him. The cold water quickly robbed her of the strength needed to keep herself at the surface. Her body was recovered later that afternoon, once the surrounding ice was assessed and a safe access point was established. The cause of death was determined to be drowning following cold water immersion. A review confirmed the boundary rope and warning signs were properly in place and that she had crossed into the restricted area voluntarily after being verbally warned by another visitor. Witness accounts from 3 people corroborated the full sequence of events. The case was closed as an accidental death with no negligence found on the part of the recreational area. The section where she went through was marked and left undisturbed for the remainder of the season. Thanks for watching. If you liked these stories, click here